After the end of the war, more than half of the German population found itself in undesirable situations and outside their places of origin. This included around 9 million people who had been bombed and evacuated, 14 million refugees and exiles, 10 million forced laborers who had been liberated, and prisoners, in addition to an uncountable number of prisoners of war who were slowly returning. How this multitude of people, disheveled, displaced and impoverished, was dismantled and reintegrated, and how the former national comrades Volksgenossen, as German citizens were known during the Nazi regime, gradually resumed their lives as ordinary citizens, are questions that risk being forgotten in light of the magnitude of historical events. The most significant changes occurred in daily life, such as in the organization of food, looting, monetary exchanges, and shopping. Issues related to love also arose as a period of fleeting sexual relationships followed the war. There was great disappointment when the long-awaited husbands did not return home. However, many Germans began to see things differently, longing for a new beginning, which led to a significant increase in divorce rates. Today, we're going to take a detailed look at what Germany and its people were like a decade after the end of the Second World War. Don't forget to leave your like if you enjoyed the topic. The collective memory of the post-war period in Germany is marked by certain images that left a strong impression on people's minds. The Russian soldier tearing a bicycle from a woman's hands, sinister figures of the black market gathering around a few eggs, temporary barracks housing refugees and people whose homes had been bombed, and women holding photographs of their missing husbands, questioning returning prisoners of war. These visually powerful images became fixed in the German public memory of the early post-war years, like a silent and unchanging film. Although it is important to note that half of the story ends in the editing room. While memory usually wraps the past in a softer light, over the years, the opposite has been true for the post-war period in Germany. With time, it became increasingly somber. One of the reasons for this lies in the widespread need among Germans, who were not persecuted by the Nazi regime, to nevertheless see themselves as victims. Many people felt that the darker the accounts of the truly terrible winters of hunger of 1946 and 1947 were, the smaller their guilt would be. Nevertheless, if we pay attention, it is also possible to perceive laughter. A spontaneous carnival procession by Rose M. Montag passed through a terribly depopulated settlement as early as 1946. The journalist Margaret Bowery recalled the feeling that life was enormously intensified by the imminent proximity of death. During the years when there was nothing to buy, she felt so content that she decided not to make large purchases, even when things improved. Misery cannot be understood without the pleasure it provokes. Escaping death led some to apathy, while others developed a passionate love for life. The established order of things had been dismantled, families torn apart, connections lost. But people were beginning to reconnect, and the young and lively faced chaos like an amusement park where they sought their joy anew every day. The Holocaust had a surprisingly small presence in the consciousness of most Germans in the post-war period. Some acknowledged the crimes committed on the Eastern Front and felt a certain fundamental guilt for having started the war. But many simply could not integrate the mass murder of millions of Jews, Germans, and Europeans into their thoughts and emotions. Only a few people, such as the philosopher Karl Jaspers, addressed the issue publicly. Jews were not even explicitly mentioned in the widely debated declarations of guilt by the Protestant and Catholic churches in August 1945. Insidiously, the unimaginable nature of the Holocaust also infiltrated the consciousness of the nation that perpetrated it. The crimes were of such immense magnitude that they were expelled from the collective consciousness, even while they were occurring. The fact that even well-intentioned people refused to consider the fate of their deported neighbors severely shook confidence in humanity to this day, and most Germans of the time bore the guilt of that omission. The concealment of the extermination camps persisted even after the end of the war, despite the efforts of the Allies to forcibly confront the defeated German people with evidence of Nazi crimes. The post-war Chancellor, Helmut Kohl, used the sarcastic phrase, "the blessing of late birth," to suggest that the younger generation had no right to feel morally superior to the previous one. However, there was also the blessing of the experience of terror. The nights of aerial bombings, the severe winters of hunger in the early post-war years, and the intense struggle for survival under conditions of everyday chaos prevented many Germans from reflecting on the past. They saw themselves as victims and therefore had the ambiguous fortune of not needing to face the truth. Because if they still had even a minimum of decency after everything that had happened, if they were aware of the systematic mass murder committed in their name, with their implicit support, and due to their willingness to close their eyes, they would hardly have had the courage and energy to survive the post-war years. The instinct for survival dampened feelings of guilt, a collective phenomenon that was studied in the years after 1945, and that must be deeply disturbing for those who still believe in humanity. Although works such as The Diary of Anne Frank or The SS State by Eugen Kogon interrupted the process of repression, it was only with the beginning of the Auschwitz trials in 1963 that many Germans began to confront the crimes committed in their name. In the eyes of the younger generation, Germans had brought extreme dishonor upon themselves by postponing the trials, even if in material terms they had benefited considerably from their parents' capacity for repression. Rarely in history has there been a generational conflict fought with as much bitterness, anger, and self-confidence as that of the young Germans of 1968 against their parents. Today, the general impression of the German people regarding the post-war years is shaped by the perspective of those who were young at that time. The anti-authoritarian anger that children felt toward their parents' generation, a generation that did not become easy to love, was so intense. Their criticism so eloquent that the myth of a suffocating layer of antiquity that needed to be removed still dominates. The image of the 1950s, maintained by most Germans, persists despite more sophisticated historical research. The generation born around 1950 prided itself on the role it played in making the Federal Republic of West Germany livable and in giving democracy a heart, and that image continues to be promoted by that generation. However, during that period, there remained a strong presence of the old Nazi elite in the offices of the Federal Republic, which caused repulsion among many, as did the speed with which Nazi criminals received amnesty. Despite this, the post-war era in Germany was marked by intense energy, a more open life, more critical intellectuals, a wide variety of opinions, more innovative art, and a more contradictory everyday life than the impressions that have prevailed since 1968 to the present day might suggest. There is another reason why the first 4 years of the post-war period in Germany represent a relative blind spot in historical memory. Between the great chapters and titles of historical research, they form a kind of void for which, generally speaking, no one assumes responsibility. A major chapter of German school history deals with the Nazi regime, ending with the capitulation of the German Wehrmacht, while the next, beginning in 1949, tells the history of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, and focuses at best on the currency reform and the Berlin blockade as a backdrop to the founding of the two states. The years between the end of the war and the currency reform, the great economic breakthrough of the Federal Republic, are in a way a neglected period in historiography, since they have no clearly defined institutional subject. The writing of German history continues to be essentially structured as a national history, placing the state as the central political subject. However, from 1945 onward, four political centers, Washington, Moscow, London, and Paris, were responsible for German history, each exercising authority over its designated occupation zone, which made the construction of a coherent national narrative difficult. Classroom evaluations of the crimes committed against Jews and forced laborers generally end with the liberation of the survivors by Allied soldiers. However, what happened to them after that? And what happened to the nearly 10 million prisoners, hungry, uprooted from their homelands, and now abandoned without supervision in the land of their torturers and murderers? The dynamics between Allied soldiers, defeated Germans, and liberated forced laborers is one of the saddest but also most fascinating aspects of the post-war years. As the consequences unfold, the focus shifts from social aspects of daily life, such as cleaning, romantic relationships, theft and shopping, to cultural aspects, intellectual life, and the flourishing of a new radical visual aesthetic. Here, issues of conscience, guilt, and repression are examined more incisively. The cases of denazification, which also had aesthetic components, are treated with care. The remarkable lasting fame of the arts, including architecture, painting, film, among others, of the 1950s can be attributed to a surprising factor. The transformation of the environment led Germans to transform themselves. However, the question arises as to whether Germans were really the only ones responsible for so radically transforming the appearance of the world around them. A dispute over concepts of design and abstract art emerged, in which the occupying powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia, exerted influence. This had to do with the decorative aesthetics of the two German republics, contrasting the socialist realism of the East with the abstract art of the West, shaping perceptions of beauty. During the Cold War, even the CIA was involved in this context more than today. Germans tended to present themselves as refined, sophisticated, and deeply immersed in serious discussions, as if it were possible to perfectly rescue the manners of the 19th century that had been transformed into the good old days. Today we know much about the Holocaust. However, what we know less about is how life in Germany continued under the shadow it cast over the country's future as a nation in whose name many millions of people were murdered. Addressing questions of culture and morality, it would be better, as a matter of decency, to avoid speaking about decency as a whole, and instead let children discover for themselves what is good and what is bad. In the years immediately after the war, media analysts, together with other institutions, were engaged in the reconstruction of society. Everyone was desperately searching for meaning. Philosophizing among the ruins of existence meant searching for meaning, just as many limited themselves to searching for remnants among the rubble. In 1945, when Allied troops entered the concentration camps, they found piles of people who had been murdered, testimony to the mass murder committed by the Nazis. The soldiers also discovered thousands of survivors, Jewish and non-Jewish, suffering from hunger and disease. For the survivors, the prospect of rebuilding their lives was terrifying. After liberation, many Jewish survivors feared returning to their former homes due to anti-Semitism. Hatred toward Jews persisted in parts of Europe, and in addition to the trauma they had suffered, some who returned home feared for their lives. In post-war Poland, for example, there were a series of pogroms, violent riots against Jews. The largest of these occurred in the city of Kielce in 1946, when Polish rioters killed at least 42 Jews and injured many others. With few opportunities for emigration, tens of thousands of homeless Holocaust survivors migrated westward to other European territories liberated by the Western Allies. There they were housed in hundreds of refugee centers and displaced persons camps, such as Bergen-Belsen in Germany. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, and the occupation armies of the United States, Great Britain, and France administered these camps. A considerable number and variety of Jewish agencies worked to assist displaced Jewish persons. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee provided Holocaust survivors with food and clothing, while the Organization for Rehabilitation through Training, ORT, offered vocational training. Refugees also formed their own organizations, and many worked toward the establishment of an independent Jewish state in Palestine. The largest organization of survivors, She'erit HaPleta, in Hebrew, Surviving Remnant, pressed for greater opportunities for emigration. However, opportunities for legal immigration to the United States beyond existing quota restrictions remained limited. The British restricted immigration to Palestine. Many borders in Europe were also closed to these homeless people. The Jewish Brigade Group, a Palestinian Jewish unit of the British Army, was formed in late 1944, together with former partisan fighters displaced in Central Europe. The Jewish Brigade Group created the Brisha, in Hebrew flight or escape. This organization aimed to facilitate the exodus of Jewish refugees from Europe to Palestine. Jews already living in Palestine organized illegal immigration by ship, also known as Aliyah Bet. However, British authorities intercepted and returned most of these vessels. In 1947, the British forced the ship Exodus 1947, which was carrying 4,500 Holocaust survivors, to Palestine to return to Germany. In most cases, the British detained Jewish refugees who were denied entry into Palestine in detention camps on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. With the establishment of the State of Israel in May 1948, displaced persons and Jewish refugees began migrating to the new sovereign state. Possibly close to 170,000 displaced persons and Jewish refugees had immigrated to Israel by 1953. In December 1945, President Harry Truman issued a directive that relaxed immigration quota restrictions to the United States for persons displaced by the Nazi regime. Under this directive, more than 41,000 displaced persons immigrated to the United States. Approximately 28,000 were Jews. In 1948, the United States Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act. The act provided approximately 400,000 immigration visas to the United States for displaced persons between January 1, 1949 and December 31, 1952. Of the 400,000 displaced persons who entered the U.S. under the Displaced Persons Act, approximately 68,000 were Jews. Other Jewish refugees in Europe emigrated as displaced persons or refugees to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Mexico, South America, and South Africa. If we now turn the prism and take a look at relations between East Germany and West Germany, we find that under Chancellor Adenauer, West Germany declared its right to speak on behalf of the entire German nation with an exclusive mandate. The Holstein Doctrine, which governed West Germany, implied the non-recognition of East Germany and restricted or often interrupted diplomatic relations with countries that granted East Germany the status of a sovereign state. The constant flow of East Germans fleeing across the inner German border from East Germany to West Germany placed great strain on relations between the two during the 1950s. East Germany sealed the borders with West Germany in 1952, but people continued to flee from East Berlin to West Berlin. On August 13, 1961, East Germany began constructing the Berlin Wall around West Berlin to reduce the flow of refugees to a trickle, effectively dividing the city in two and transforming West Berlin into an enclave of the Western world in communist territory. The wall became the symbol of the Cold War and the division of Europe. Shortly thereafter, the main border between the two German states was fortified. In 1969, Chancellor Willy Brandt announced that West Germany would remain firmly rooted in the Atlantic Alliance but would intensify efforts to improve relations with the Eastern Bloc, especially with East Germany. Relations between West Germany and East Germany raised particularly difficult questions. Although eager to alleviate severe hardships for divided families and reduce friction, West Germany, under Brandt's Ostpolitik, was determined to maintain its concept of two German states within one German nation. Relations gradually improved. In the early 1970s, Ostpolitik led to a form of mutual recognition between East and West Germany. The Moscow Treaty, August 1970. The Warsaw Treaty, December 1970. The Four-Power Agreement on Berlin, September 1971. The Transit Agreement, May 1972. And the Basic Treaty, December 1972, helped normalize relations between East and West Germany and led both states to join the United Nations in September 1973. If you feel this video brought you value in any way, please subscribe to the channel. Fasvim series. See you soon.